In the summer of 2001, a serene Pennsylvania town became the focal point of a chilling mystery when three 7-year-old triplet girls vanished without a trace during an annual church picnic. The disappearance was sudden, leaving no evidence, no signs of struggle, and no hint of an intruder. Only an ominous silence that enveloped the area. The entire community was gripped by profound bewilderment and anxiety. Immediate search parties meticulously combed dense forests. Helicopters tirelessly circled overhead, and flyers with the missing children's photos flooded every mailbox. Yet all efforts proved futile. Days turned into weeks, and hope for a safe return gradually gave way to deep mourning. Their mother, Rebecca Whitmore, despite overwhelming pain and haunting memories, refused to accept the loss, desperately clinging to a faint hope and constantly tormented by the same question. Where could they have gone? 17 years later, when it seemed the case would forever remain unsolved, a young woman appeared at a police station in Cleveland, Ohio. She carried no identification and could not provide a coherent story of her past, yet she stated with astonishing certainty that she was one of the missing triplets. When DNA analysis irrefutably confirmed her words, the entire world, which had followed the story, literally held its breath. What she revealed next shocked everyone who heard her account, for the true background of that fateful day proved to be incomparably more horrifying than the darkest assumptions. On June 24, 2001, a warm Sunday afternoon, an idyllic atmosphere prevailed in the tranquil town of Brookville, Pennsylvania. Numerous families gathered within the walls of St. Mary's Church to celebrate the traditional annual summer picnic. Children played barefoot on the emerald grass, tables overflowed with an abundance of treats, and the air was filled with joyful laughter echoing under the open sky. For the Whitmore family, this day promised to be an embodiment of joy, deep faith, and family unity. Rebecca and Daniel Whitmore brought their three 7-year-old triplet daughters, Emma, Lily, and Grace, who had been virtually inseparable since birth. Dressed in identical summer dresses with bright ribbons woven into their hair, the girls spent the entire afternoon playing at the edge of the woods directly behind the church, chasing butterflies and giggling with their classmates. It was a scene straight out of a holiday postcard, until in an instant it ceased to be. At approximately 3:15 p.m., Rebecca Whitmore instinctively turned to ensure her daughters were safe, but found only an empty clearing where the girls had been playing moments before. She began calling their names, first with slight nonchalance, then with escalating, all-consuming panic. Daniel, her husband, rushed towards the trees, assuming the girls might have simply wandered a bit further than allowed. However, within minutes, other parents nearby began to notice alarming notes in Rebecca's voice, foreshadowing disaster. The girls were nowhere to be seen. At 3:35 p.m., 911 was immediately called. Within an hour, Brookville police officers arrived at the scene, and by sunset, the entire area around the church had transformed into a massive search zone. Hundreds of volunteers, forming chains, meticulously combed the adjacent wooded areas. Specially trained search dogs were deployed. Police officers questioned every adult and child present at the picnic. A helicopter equipped with a thermal imager hovered overhead, scanning every part of the terrain. But despite all efforts, absolutely no clues were found. No broken branches, no discarded toys, not even footprints indicating their direction of departure. It seemed the triplets had simply vanished in a thin air, disappearing without a trace. News of the tragedy spread instantly, and the media quickly picked up the chilling story. By that same evening, local news channels began broadcasting emergency reports with headlines screaming, "Three sisters vanish without a trace from church picnic." Photos of the girls, smiling, holding hands tightly in front of their school, flashed across every television screen, eliciting a wave of sympathy and alarm. Rebecca Whitmore, their mother, stood before the cameras, her voice trembling with grief and despair, as she pleaded with the public to help bring her daughters home. Days relentlessly turned into weeks, and the search yielded no results. Hundreds of flyers with images of the missing girls were posted throughout the county, hoping for public assistance. Police services set up special hotlines, meticulously checking every tip received and investigating every report. Yet none of this brought them closer to solving the triplets' disappearance. There were no ransom calls, surveillance cameras recorded no suspicious vehicles, and among the numerous witnesses present at the picnic, no one remembered the girls leaving the premises. The church parking lot was full, but no one present noticed anything unusual that could shed light on what happened. By early July, the atmosphere surrounding the investigation had drastically changed. The Whitmore family, previously seen as objects of sympathy and sorrow, now found themselves under intense scrutiny and suspicion. Disturbing rumors began to circulate actively in town. People whispered about Daniel's, the girl's father, allegedly cold and detached behavior, as well as a recent argument overheard between him and a neighbor. Some even dared to suggest that the parents knew much more than they were telling the investigation. However, despite these conjectures, the police could not find any evidence of their involvement in wrongdoing or identify specific suspects. Ultimately, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, joined the investigation, classifying the case as an abduction with unknown motives. Nevertheless, due to the complete absence of any leads or physical evidence, the investigation significantly slowed down. Eventually, this case, unfortunately, was reclassified as a cold case, an unsolved crime. For the Whitmore family, a tormenting era began, filled with oppressive silence, heavy suspicions, and a home where each of the 3 bedrooms remained empty, a constant reminder of an irreplaceable loss. Rebecca, the girl's mother, refused to accept what had happened and move on with her life. Annually, on June 24th, the anniversary of the disappearance, she held a mournful candlelight vigil outside the church where her daughters were last seen. Rebecca, in some inexplicable way, continued to believe her daughters were alive. The girls' room remained untouched, exactly as it was on that fateful day. Neatly made beds, books still on the shelves, and even the plush rabbit Emma carried with her still sitting on the windowsill. They didn't disappear, she firmly told a local reporter in 2007. Someone took them, and someone definitely knows what happened. Meanwhile, the rest of Brookville's residents seemed to strive to forget this tragic story. Over time, it gradually faded from news headlines. The annual church picnic continued in subsequent years, but its attendance noticeably decreased. Parents now held their children's hands tighter, and the once unshakable trust between neighbors had thinned to a breaking point. For 17 long years, the town lived with this unhealed wound, constantly reminding itself, offering no peace. Then, in March 2018, an event occurred that forever changed the course of this story. A young woman, appearing to be about 24 years old, walked into a police station in Cleveland, Ohio. She had no identification, no known relatives, and remembered nothing of her early childhood. The only thing she knew was that she had been raised by an elderly woman who had passed away a year earlier. Before her death, this woman confessed that she was not her biological mother and that her past held secrets best left unspoken. However, the girl had many questions that demanded answers. And when her DNA was tested as part of a standard missing persons database check, everything changed dramatically. The results showed not a partial or close match, but an absolutely exact one. This young woman was Emma Whitmore, one of the 3 triplets who had vanished without a trace 17 years ago. This stunning revelation struck the world like a lightning bolt piercing the silence. 17 years after that fateful church picnic, which had irrevocably shattered the lives of the Whitmore family, Emma was alive. However, the initial joy of this incredible discovery quickly turned into deep confusion and anxiety. The young woman sitting across from the detective in the Cleveland, Ohio police station had no memory of being named Emma. She retained no recollections of her sisters, and even the name Brookville, her hometown, meant nothing to her. Her voice was calm and steady, yet utterly empty, devoid of emotion. It was the voice of someone who seemed to have spent her entire life in the shadow of another's lies, concealing the truth of her origins. Cleveland police immediately contacted Pennsylvania authorities to report the incredible discovery. At the moment the call came, Rebecca Whitmore, lost in thought, was watering her garden, a quiet, peaceful activity that helped her temporarily distract from the all-consuming pain that never left her heart. She dropped the garden hose as soon as she heard the officer's words. "Emma has been found alive." Her knees instantly buckled, and her eyes filled with tears that streamed down her face. She didn't even question if it was a mistake. Instead, barely audible, she whispered, "I knew it. I knew she was out there." Rebecca was transported to Cleveland under heavy police escort, emphasizing the exceptional nature of the moment. When she finally entered the police station room, her gaze immediately fell upon the young woman, in whose eyes Rebecca unmistakably recognized the features of her daughter. Emma stood motionless, as if frozen, unsure how to react to what was happening. Rebecca extended her hand, her fingers visibly trembling with emotion. She did not demand immediate recognition or a hug. Instead, with deep tenderness, she simply said, "You're home." Emma did not cry or utter a word, but she carefully took Rebecca's hand and held it, as if it were something incredibly fragile yet completely unfamiliar. A profound silence settled between them, which seemed to speak far more than any spoken words. This reunion was incredibly cautious, gentle, and full of deep uncertainty, foreshadowing a long journey to restore lost connections. Over the next few days, Emma was transported back to Pennsylvania, where she was placed under careful psychological observation. Doctors and specialists hoped that returning to familiar surroundings might somehow awaken lost memories, but Emma's mind remained like a locked door, and no one knew where the key was. The little she remembered of her childhood was fragmented and extremely strange. She recounted growing up on a remote farm in rural Ohio, raised by a woman she knew only as Miss Connie. This woman was strict but not cruel. She was distant but never violent. Emma was homeschooled, rarely allowed to leave the farm, and never permitted to ask questions about her past. She had no birth certificate, no childhood photos, and no friends. From a young age, Connie instilled in her that her biological mother had died of a heart attack and that she had no siblings. Whenever Emma tried to learn more, Connie would fall silent and utter the same phrase, "Some things are best left alone." Emma never pressed for details, accepting the story as the only truth available to her. However, after Miss Connie passed away a year earlier, something subtly changed in Emma's life. While going through old boxes in the attic, she stumbled upon a faded photograph, neatly tucked into an old book. The picture showed 3 identical little girls standing in a row in identical sundresses. In the corner of the photo, in smudged ink, was a name, Whitmore, her own name. Emma couldn't explain why, but the moment her gaze fell upon that image, her chest inexplicably tightened. It was like a sudden flash of a memory she didn't even know she had. That's when she began to question her entire life. She started searching online, trying to find information under the name Whitmore, and eventually came across a website dedicated to cold cases, where among the photos of missing persons, she found her own childhood picture. At that moment, everything clicked into place, and she realized the horrifying truth. News of the incredible discovery spread like wildfire, sweeping across the country. Headlines like "Missing Triplet Found Alive After 17 Years" flashed across national news channels, captivating millions. Journalists from all corners of the country immediately camped outside the Whitmore home, eager to get exclusive details of this astonishing story. The town of Brookville, which had recently been paralyzed by overwhelming pain and grief, now erupted in stunned disbelief and shock. People whispered in grocery stores, concocted the most incredible theories in church pews, and actively discussed what had happened on social media, trying to comprehend the unbelievable. However, beneath the veneer of universal shock lay a much deeper and more agonizing question. Where were Lily and Grace, the other 2 triplets? And why was Emma the one who survived, escaping their fate? Emma remained silent for several weeks after returning home. She spent most of her time alone, watching the wind gently sway the tree branches outside her childhood bedroom window, trying to find any familiar features in her surroundings. She had no memory of that fateful picnic or her sisters. But sometimes, in her dreams, vivid, fleeting flashes of memories pierced her consciousness. Bare feet sliding on wet grass, the distant sound of children's laughter, and a sensation of someone's hand pulling her firmly along. One night, during a fierce thunderstorm, Emma finally spoke. She told her mother about a room, dark, windowless, a place where she had lived for some time before being moved to the farm. She distinctly remembered her sisters crying in that same room. She remembered them being taken one by one, and how Connie, her abductor, told her that she was quiet, and that quiet girls stay. Rebecca listened, her heart literally tearing apart with horror. The horror was not just that Emma had been stolen. The true horror was the realization that someone had coldly chosen which child to keep alive and mercilessly discarded the others like unwanted things. The days following Emma's memory breakthrough were filled with tension and oppressive silence. Rebecca stayed by her daughter's side, afraid to push too hard, but at the same time terrified of losing the few fragments of truth Emma was finally beginning to recover. Local investigators reopened the case with a new, astonishing urgency. Now, they had a living witness, someone who had survived this nightmare. But Emma's memories were scattered, like burnt pieces of a puzzle buried under layers of time, almost 2 decades old. She remembered being led away from the picnic, though she couldn't recall who did it. She distinctly remembered the feeling of her small hand in another, a firm and swift adult grip. She recalled a strange smell, something sweet and decaying at the same time, and then the sound of a van door slamming shut. After that, there was complete darkness. The clearest image that surfaced in her mind was that very room. Emma described a cold, windowless space with peeling wallpaper and a single bare light bulb that flickered dimly overhead. At first, she and her sisters were kept together in this room. They slept on thin mattresses, ate bland food from paper plates, and were strictly forbidden to cry. A voice, Connie's voice, came through the door, repeating, "Good girls don't make noise. Good girls will eventually come home." But they never did. One day, Lily was taken. Emma distinctly remembered her sister's small hand slipping from her grasp. She never saw her again. A week later, Grace also disappeared. Emma was left completely alone in that eerie room. She cried and screamed for days until she was exhausted. Connie did not return for a long time, and when she finally appeared, she led Emma upstairs and told her, "You're quiet, good, the only one who didn't resist." This was the day Emma's story changed forever. She was no longer a missing triplet. She became a completely different person. Connie renamed her Anna. She burned all the girls' clothes and threw out everything from the basement to erase any traces of her past. Since then, Emma lived in complete isolation, homeschooled, told fabricated stories, shaping her into an entirely new identity. Her memories, suppressed by fear and constant manipulation, became hazy, fragmented pieces deeply hidden in her consciousness. Now, 17 years later, the police finally had a real lead. But the situation was extremely difficult. Connie had died a year earlier from lung cancer, taking all her secrets with her. Her farm was abandoned and sold at auction. By the time authorities arrived, it was almost completely empty. No records, no photos, no signs of the dark basement room Emma described. Only a renovated guest room with fresh drywall and new floors, concealing the truth. However, the floor plan held the key to the puzzle. Original blueprints of the house, found in county records, showed that a small basement room did indeed exist directly beneath the room Emma remembered. It had been meticulously sealed. According to renovation documents from around 2007, police opened the floors. What they discovered chilled them to the bone. The space was real. It exactly matched Emma's memories. A narrow, claustrophobic cell with crumbling concrete walls and rusty pipes running overhead. In the corner lay a discarded child's sandal, faded pink with a torn strap. Forensic experts later matched it to the shoes the triplets wore on the day of their disappearance. But that was all. No bones, no blood, no clear signs of Lily or Grace. Just enough to prove Emma was telling the truth, and not enough to explain what happened to her sisters. Investigators began questioning Connie's old acquaintances, trying to gather any information. A former neighbor recalled hearing strange noises at night, but dismissed them as rural animals. A retired mail carrier remembered never delivering mail directly to the farm. Connie always picked it up at the post office, explaining that she preferred privacy. A distant relative of Connie's admitted that she had once worked as a cleaner at St. Mary's Church in Brookville, but was fired for inappropriate behavior with children. This was the first time anyone had linked Connie to Brookville, the site of the triplets' disappearance. Slowly but surely, a horrifying theory began to form. Connie either abducted the girls herself or was paid to hide them. But who else knew about this? And why abduct 3 children only to keep one alive? When detectives traced Connie's financial history, they found one last, completely inexplicable payment, $10,000 deposited into her account in July 2001, just 1 month after the triplets' disappearance. The source of the payment was a now-defunct LLC registered to a P.O. box in New Jersey. Whatever happened to Lily and Grace, it was no accident. It was meticulously planned. Meanwhile, Emma struggled immensely with the flood of memories. Each new breakthrough brought her fresh, sharp pain. She felt guilty for surviving, for being alive while her sisters disappeared. She didn't remember enough to save her sisters, and it tormented her. But she couldn't forget the oppressive silence of that room, the feeling of absence, the agonizing choice that had been made. One night, she asked her mother, "Why me?" Rebecca had no answer, but deep down, she feared the true truth. Someone chose her daughter and mercilessly discarded the others. And that person was still at large, posing a threat. The discovery of the sealed basement changed everything. Now it wasn't just about Emma and her fate. It was about Lily and Grace, and who decided they didn't deserve to survive. Detectives, with a new, furious urgency, began digging into Connie's life. She had always been a recluse in the town of Willow Creek, Ohio. She had no friends, no social connections, no steady job. Her neighbors knew little about her, except that she kept to herself and never liked visitors. But one thing stood out. She never lacked money, despite not working. Bank records confirmed a disturbing pattern. In addition to the $10,000 deposit made shortly after the triplets' disappearance, smaller payments, ranging from $3,000 to $5,000, were made regularly for over a decade. They came from different accounts under different names, all traced back to shell corporations with no real business activity. Someone was systematically paying Connie to keep Emma a secret. But why? The deeper investigators dug, the more convoluted and sinister the picture became. An anonymous tip led detectives to an old photograph taken in 2000, a year before the abduction. It showed Connie standing at a church event in Brookville. In the background, holding a clipboard, was a man named Richard Galloway, who was a respected deacon at St. Mary's Church at the time. He had moved out of state in 2003 and completely vanished from public life, as if he had dissolved. Authorities tracked him down to a retirement community in Florida. When questioned, Richard vehemently denied knowing Connie personally, but phone records told a completely different story. They had exchanged dozens of calls between 2000 and 2002. ATM surveillance footage showed him withdrawing large sums of cash days before the abduction. And then there was the most chilling discovery of all, found in a box of old church records. In the 2001 staff roster, Connie Ellis was listed as a temporary replacement in the church nursery the week before the picnic. She was inside the building. She knew the layout. She had access to the children. Suddenly, the abduction no longer looked like a random act of madness. It looked like a well-planned operation involving more than one person and more than one motive. But what was the true purpose? Emma, with the help of experienced therapists and memory recovery specialists, began to recall more and more details. She remembered overhearing Connie and a man arguing fiercely about too many mouths to feed, about one being enough, and about how to get rid of the problem. She remembered being told to forget her name, to forget she ever had sisters. And when she cried at night, Connie would sit by her bed and whisper, "You're lucky. You were chosen." This phrase echoed in Emma's mind like a haunting curse. The media, once captivated by the story of miraculous survival, now circled the story with sharper teeth, ready to attack. They asked difficult, uncomfortable questions. Was the church involved? Was this part of a larger child trafficking ring? Why did no one investigate Connie's case earlier, when she was alive? The police, under immense public pressure, formed a special task force. But their hands were tied. Connie was dead, and her death took many answers with her. Richard Galloway, now frail and legally blind, could not be charged without irrefutable evidence. The corporations that transferred money had long been dissolved, their traces lost. Rebecca felt the walls closing in around her. Every step forward in the investigation brought more horror, but never the answer she truly wanted. Where were Lily and Grace? One overcast afternoon, she visited Connie's grave. Emma came too, reluctantly, but with deep curiosity. There was no headstone, only a flat plaque with a name and 2 dates. Rebecca stood over it in silence, then whispered, addressing the dead woman, "Why them?" Emma knelt beside her, sharing her grief. "I don't think she ever saw us as people," she said, her voice quiet and thoughtful. "Just things to give away, hide, or discard." Back home, Emma began to draw. It was something she had secretly done during her years on the farm. Now, she drew what she could remember: the dark room, the crooked stairs, the faces of her sisters. With each stroke, her memory became sharper and clearer. With each new picture Emma created, Rebecca saw more of her daughter returning to her, as if a lost soul was being restored piece by piece. However, this slow healing could not erase the deep injustice that had pierced their lives. The town of Brookville was shaken to its core, its foundations rattled. St. Mary's Church faced a barrage of criticism, and former parishioners began sharing stories of other strange incidents that had occurred over the years. Some claimed to have seen Connie on church grounds long before her dismissal, raising even more questions. Others said that Richard Galloway, as a deacon, had too much control over staff, especially during children's events, which seemed suspicious. The institution, in turn, vehemently denied all accusations and its involvement in what happened. And yet, there was no denying the horrifying tragedy that had befallen the Whitmore family. Emma was taken, hidden, and deceived, robbed of her childhood and identity. Her sisters were erased from life, as if they had never existed. And the truth, however close it came, still seemed agonizingly out of reach, slipping through their fingers. Hope, at times, can be the cruelest companion. As Emma safely returned home, and disturbing, chilling truths began to emerge. Rebecca Whitmore refused to accept that her other daughters were gone forever. She convinced herself, if Emma was alive, if she had survived 17 years under a different name, then Lily and Grace might still be out there somewhere, waiting to be rescued. She channeled all her energy into finding them, transforming her pain into an indomitable resolve. An old billboard, which in 2001 had featured the faces of all the triplets, was restored and re-erected on the highway leading into town. This time, only 2 faces remained under the words "still missing," symbolizing unbroken hope. Rebecca reappeared on national television, this time sitting beside her daughter, which lent her words special power. Emma, holding her mother's hand tightly, shared the little she knew. She described voices, footsteps outside the basement door, and the sound of crying that wasn't her own. "I think they were taken from me one by one," she said in a quiet, broken voice. "And they never came back." This interview once again drew national attention to the long-forgotten case. Hotlines were reopened, and calls began pouring in from all corners of the country. Some from psychics, others from people claiming to have seen girls resembling the missing children. One caller from West Virginia persistently claimed to have seen 2 small girls being led into an old barn in 2003. Another woman from Michigan reported a chance encounter at a gas station with two frightened children who refused to speak, which aroused her suspicion. Investigators meticulously checked every lead, but unfortunately, nothing was confirmed. Meanwhile, the family hired a private search firm specializing in long-term child abductions, using funds raised through a public campaign. With access to advanced facial recognition software, digital archives, and missing persons databases, they scoured school yearbooks, social media, and online forums, trying to find any trace. They ran simulations of what Lily and Grace might look like at age 24, but no match was ever confirmed, leaving the family in agonizing suspense. A breakthrough seemed imminent when an anonymous letter arrived at the Brookville Police Department. It was written in shaky, illegible handwriting and mailed from New Mexico. It read, "They weren't supposed to be found. They were a message." And further, the quiet one was a mistake. You should have stopped digging. The letter had no return address, no fingerprints, and no DNA that could be traced to any known profile. Forensic analysts deemed it authentic and extremely disturbing, indicating that someone involved in the case was still at large. FBI agents revisited Connie's farm, but again found no trace of the other two girls, which only deepened their despair. They reached out to regional law enforcement in 4 states, asking for help to re-examine any unidentified remains of young girls found between 2001 and 2005. Nothing matched, and this was another blow. Rebecca began to feel the weight of time, her energy waning, and media interest in the case gradually faded. Emma, too, battled internal demons. As her memories returned in fragments, so did an overwhelming sense of guilt. She often woke up in the middle of the night screaming, calling her sisters' names. Therapy helped, but nothing could silence the question that haunted her. Why did they choose me? Emma became obsessed with finding answers, trying to fill the gaps in her memory. She looked through old photographs, staring for hours at her childhood face next to Lily and Grace, trying to recall every detail. She kept journals filled with everything she could remember about the dark room, about Connie, about any clue that might lead them back. But the more she searched, the more it felt like chasing ghosts that eluded her. "I feel like I'm still in that room," she once told her therapist, "just waiting, still quiet." The town began to slowly, cautiously move on, trying to heal its wounds. The church picnic was canceled permanently, becoming a symbol of the tragedy. St. Mary's Church underwent changes in leadership. Renovations were carried out, and it issued public statements vehemently denying any involvement or knowledge of the crimes. But some residents could not forget what had happened. Brookville became a place where something sacred was broken, and no amount of paint or prayers could hide the deep cracks that ran through its soul. Rebecca, now in her 60s, left a light on her porch every night, hoping that if Lily or Grace ever found their way home, they would recognize their house. She also left their rooms unchanged, beds made, clothes neatly folded, and a new calendar hung on the wall each year, as if time had not passed and the girls could return at any moment. Emma, trying to live beyond mere survival, enrolled in community college under her real name. She studied psychology, hoping one day to help others who had been stolen from themselves, who had lost their identity. But the weight of the unknown always hung over her, like a sword of Damocles. Some nights she sat alone in the backyard and listened to the wind, remembering the story Connie whispered to her before bed. "Some children are like candles. Blow them out, and no one will even know they were lit." Now Emma held a match in her hand and was still trying to light up the darkness to find answers. 17 years of silence, followed by the return of one daughter, should have brought healing and peace. But in reality, it brought something entirely different, an open, bleeding wound that seemed like it would never close. Rebecca Whitmore, once the smiling, soft-spoken mother of 3, became a symbol of quiet but indomitable perseverance. Years of suffering had etched worry onto her face and made her voice softer, as if always on the verge of breaking. And now, even with Emma home, the question that tormented her was not why, but why only her? She kept 3 photo frames on the mantelpiece. One had been updated. Emma at 24, shyly smiling in a new student ID. The other two, Lily and Grace, remained frozen in time in their sundresses and ribbons. 7 years old, unchanged, untouched, like ghosts of the past. Emma felt the weight of these frames every day, sensing their presence. She tried to be present, to be the daughter her mother still deserved, trying to fill the void. But no amount of hugs or quiet laughter at the dinner table could erase that overwhelming absence. Sometimes, when Emma left the room, Rebecca would look at the two old photos and whisper, "I haven't forgotten you. I never will." The town of Brookville had also changed, and these changes were profound. Once a place where everyone knew each other by name, it had now become wary and suspicious. Parents no longer allowed children to play alone at church events, fearing a repeat of the tragedy. The old woods near St. Mary's Church were fenced off, declared private property by the parish, so no one could enter. The annual picnic, once the most anticipated summer event, was canceled indefinitely, becoming a painful reminder of the loss. Trust was shattered, and it was impossible to rebuild. And with each passing year, fewer people spoke of what had happened, trying to forget. But for the Whitmore family, it was still the center of every day, giving them no peace. Emma, despite her gentle nature, carried her own deep scars. She rarely spoke of Connie, but nightmares betrayed her silence, breaking through. She would wake up at 2 a.m., drenched in sweat, gasping, convinced she heard crying through the walls that haunted her. Rebecca would rush into the room, hug her, whisper that she was safe, that it was all over. But Emma didn't always believe it, her mind filled with doubt. She joined a support group for abduction victims. At first, she didn't speak, just listened to other stories. Then slowly, bit by bit, she began to share her own. Other women cried with her, understanding her pain. Some shared similar memories. Basements, oppressive silence, identity manipulation that destroyed them from within. For the first time, Emma didn't feel alone, finding solace in community. Nevertheless, questions continued to torment her. What if her sisters survived? What if they were taken somewhere else, and they were alive but never had the chance to escape like her? She wrote letters addressed to Lily and Grace and kept them in a box under her bed, hoping that someday they would read them. Some were long, filled with memories that no longer belonged to her, but that she wanted to preserve. Others were just one sentence: "I'm sorry I left." One day, Rebecca found the box and quietly added 2 of her own letters, sharing her daughter's pain. Meanwhile, the investigation had slowed to a complete standstill. Connie was dead, Richard Galloway was in custody, and no physical remains of the other girls had been found. Prosecutors had no one to charge, and the case reached a dead end. The case remained open but inactive, like a grave without a headstone, symbolizing an unresolved mystery. In the eyes of the law, a faint hope still flickered, but in the eyes of the family, there was only an overwhelming emptiness. The general public began to forget the tragedy, immersing themselves in their daily concerns. But every few years, an article would appear in newspapers or news. When the triplets returned, what happened to the others? 2 people would comment, offering theories, accusations, cold conjectures, trying to unravel the mystery. Some blamed the church, others Daniel Whitmore, who died in a car accident just 3 years after the girl's disappearance, never getting answers. Rebecca never responded to any of these messages, having learned to grieve in silence, not putting her pain on display. One day, Emma gave a presentation at a psychology seminar at the university titled "Surviving in Silence." She didn't use PowerPoint, didn't provide statistics, just her voice, which was quiet but firm. "I was stolen," she said softly, addressing the audience. "And so were my sisters. But the world only looked for me when I came back." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the listeners. "Please, if you know something, anything about someone who disappeared, say it. Even if you're afraid, even if you think it's too late, because silence doesn't protect us, it buries us." The room was absolutely silent, broken only by occasional sobs. Several students cried, deeply moved by her words. The professor slowly, deliberately stood to applaud, and the entire audience followed suit. Emma left the stage and disappeared down the hallway, but her words remained, echoing in the hearts of those present. That evening at home, Rebecca placed a candle in the window, something she hadn't done in years. Not for Emma, who was nearby, but for Lily and Grace, who were still lost. She whispered their names like a prayer, hoping that somewhere in another town, a girl might see that light and wonder why it felt familiar. Somewhere, another silence might be ready to break, foreshadowing new discoveries. It was a quiet spring morning when Emma first visited the cemetery, a place where those who had passed rested. There were no headstones for Lily and Grace, her sisters, only two small white markers placed by the town years ago, with the words engraved, "Still missing, still loved." Emma stood before them in deep silence, a bouquet of delicate daisies in her hand and a multitude of unspoken questions in her eyes, reflecting her inner pain. "I'm sorry," she whispered, kneeling before the markers. "For forgetting, for surviving, for not being strong enough to stop them." The wind rustled softly in the trees, as if echoing her grief. In the distance, the sound of a school bell echoed through the valley, a reminder of life continuing. Life, it seemed, went on, but for the Whitmore family, time never moved forward. It only curled back on itself, returning again and again to the same agonizing question. Where did they go? The mystery of Lily and Grace's disappearance remained unsolved, like a sealed book. Without remains, without confirmed testimonies, and without confessions, the girls remained ghosts in the eyes of the law, their fate unknown. Statistically, authorities consider them dead, but Rebecca refused to call them that. Her maternal heart could not accept this cruel truth. In her home, they were simply not home yet, awaiting their return. She kept their room as it was in 2001, bright walls, one bed for each, dolls neatly lined up on a shelf, as if waiting for their owners. Every year on their birthday, she placed a gift on each bed, wrapped in pastel paper, with their names written in her own handwriting, preserving the tradition. Emma, now 24, still lived nearby, staying close to her mother. She began working at a local advocacy center, helping families of missing children navigate the overwhelming labyrinth of hope and grief, using her own experience. She was no longer just a survivor. She became a voice for those who were still lost, who were searching for their loved ones. And yet, she was haunted not by what she could remember, but by what she couldn't, those gaps in her memory that held the answers. Her therapist once asked, "Do you think forgetting was your mind's way of protecting you?" Emma replied, "Perhaps. But it also protected them," she continued. Because somewhere in those memory gaps, beyond Connie's whispers in the dark corners of the basement, might be the key to everything. Her sister's last moments, who came for them, why she was spared, who paid Connie, what the message truly meant, and perhaps who else knew. One evening, while sorting through old boxes in her mother's attic, Emma found something strange and unexpected, a cassette tape. It was unmarked, covered in dust, hidden between old church bulletins and newspaper clippings about the girl's disappearance, as if someone wanted to conceal it. She brought it downstairs and played it on an old tape recorder, hoping to find answers. At first, there was only static, then a faint, barely discernible voice. It was a woman, hoarse, tired, her words full of weariness. "I did what you asked. She's quiet. She listens." The others cried, "Too much." Silence. Then a man's voice, low and authoritative, said, "That's better." He said no one would ask questions. Emma stopped the recording, her hands trembling with excitement and horror. She rewound it, played it again, trying to catch every detail. He said no one would ask questions. Who was he? Emma replayed the name in her head again and again, trying to find an answer. Could it be Richard Galloway or someone else? Someone with money? Influence, a desire to erase 3 lives, and the power to make the world look away. She immediately took the recording to the police, hoping it would be a breakthrough. Forensic experts worked to enhance the audio, but the recording was old, degraded by time. They couldn't identify the voice, which was a huge disappointment. The only clue was a brief background hum and the faint sound of an organ in the distance. A hymn, perhaps recorded inside a church. But which one? And why record it all? Investigators tried to reopen the case with this new evidence, but without a voice match or a living suspect to question. The recording was just another whisper in the dark, providing no concrete answers. Nevertheless, it gave Emma something she hadn't had in a long time, a purpose. She began speaking at conferences, appearing on podcasts, writing articles under her full name, Emma Whitmore. She no longer wanted to be anonymous. Her voice had to be heard. "I came home," she said at one event, her voice filled with determination. "But my sisters didn't, and I believe someone still knows why." The world watched, listened, cared for a moment, but ultimately, even the most captivating stories are replaced by new ones, and public attention fades. The news cycle moved on. Interviews stopped. Donations slowed. But Rebecca and Emma didn't stop. They couldn't. Every Sunday, Rebecca left 3 chairs at the kitchen table. One for herself, one for Emma, and one empty just in case. Because what if one day there was a knock at the door? What if one day another girl with familiar eyes emerged from the shadows? What if one day, after all this time, the silence finally broke? Until then, there was only waiting, not hopeless, but steadfast, filled with faith. 17 years is a stolen life. For Emma, it meant growing up in the shadow of lies, a lost childhood. For Rebecca, it meant waking up every day with hope teetering on the edge of grief, a constant ache. And for Lily and Grace, whose voices were never heard again, it meant disappearing into the quiet corners of a world that failed them, that couldn't protect them. But this story is not just about loss. It's about what remains. A love that refuses to forget, a mother's devotion. The mother's light in the window that burns every night. A sister's voice rising from the silence to tell the truth. It's about the fight for truth, even when the answers never come. About the relentless search. About the belief, against all odds, that justice does not expire with time, that it will prevail. The mystery of what happened at that church picnic may never be fully solved, but Emma's return revealed a truth no one could deny. Something was taken, and someone still knows why. So, if you ever see a face that's too familiar, or hear a story that's too strange, listen. Look. Speak. Because sometimes the only thing standing between silence and salvation is someone who refuses to let the story end, who fights for the truth until the very end.